Good evening, Treasure Valley. How is everyone? I hope you're doing well. What are you up to? I'm serious. I mean, what are you doing with yourself these days? I know if you're like pretty much everybody else, you're staying at home. You're probably a little bit bored, a little bit restless. You want to go sit in Sherry's or sit in Tin Roof or sit somewhere and sit down to a meal somewhere. You want to go see a movie. I mean, like if you're like me, I'd go to Joann's Fabrics today, which is unheard of for me. But we realize in this unprecedented time that we're living in, how much we miss those things we once really took for granted. Those things that just those little things that we used to think were just so ordinary. Going to actually sit in Costa Vida is not a huge landmark event for my family, but it will be the first time we get to do it again. It's a small thing, like going to Great Clips or going to swing on a swing at the swing set in the park or going to worship with my church family. Those things that we have always kind of taken for granted that have been taken away from us here lately. I'm sitting in my office, sitting at my desk in my office. This desk is just over a year old. I love this desk. It has so much space. I've really missed having this much space to work on. But another thing, I've complained for years about this chair. This chair does this. And I end up slumping way down in this chair, and then I have to fight it like this to fix it. But I've complained about it forever. Well, what I've learned in the last few weeks is I'm not going to complain about my chair anymore. Sometimes we underestimate the value of those small, seemingly insignificant, normal things and overestimate the value of some other small things that we thought were so important, that were such big deals to us. Many of you over the last few weeks have had someone drop by your house and maybe deliver cookies or donuts or yeast, or maybe a visit out on your sidewalk, or somebody drive by your house and honk and yell out happy birthday, or maybe you've had a couple of young men in the congregation send you a couple of coloring pages, some little things like that a couple of months ago, had that happen, it would have been nice, and I would have thought, oh, that's really sweet. But now stuff like that happens and it almost makes me emotional, because those little things mean so much more right now. Just as in where we are in life right now, in our family relationships, in our church relationship, what we can see and what I want us to look at for just a minute is the number of small things that God has used in his plan and in his interaction with us, his people, with his family. You know, after Israel spent 70 years in Babylonian captivity, some 50,000 of them began the migration back home, back toward Canaan, back toward Jerusalem. Their leader was Zerubbabel, is a prince of Judah. Haggai and Zechariah were contemporary prophets of that time. They were the spokesman for God, some of the spokesmen for God at that time. Haggai's mission was to encourage the Israelites to go back and to rebuild the temple that had been destroyed by the Chaldeans in 586. His job was to convince them we need to go back and rebuild this temple. Zechariah's job was to revitalize their spiritual lives. Zechariah has this series of 8 visions, and in these visions, he brings a really, really strong message to a people who had grown somewhat apathetic. They had been very lacking in upholding the responsibility of doing this rebuilding that God had given them. In Zechariah chapter 4, in the 5th of these visions, Zechariah encourages the people to support Zerubbabel's effort. He says, we need to get behind this rebuilding of the temple to complete it. At this point, they'd started, and then it had laid dormant for about 16 years. Apparently, some people thought the work was too difficult. There were others, we see this back in Ezra chapter 3, there were others that thought what they were doing was insignificant. In Ezra chapter 3, verse 12 says, many of the older priests, Levites, and family heads who had seen the first temple wept loudly when they saw the foundation of this temple. They didn't think it was enough. They thought it was insignificant. It didn't compare to the grand temple that they were trying to replace. So look what God tells Zechariah in Zechariah chapter 4, verses 8 through 10. It says, then the word of the Lord came to me. Zerubbabel's hands have laid the foundation of this house, and his hands will complete it. Then you will know that the Lord of armies has sent me to you. For who despises the day of small things? See, God reminds them. God uses Zechariah to remind, to kind of rebuke the people for ignoring a day of small things. He is letting them know. He reminds them earlier, back in chapter 4, verse 6. It says, so he answered me, this is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel, not by strength or by might, but by my spirit, says the Lord of armies. The reminder is, even the people are discounting this work because they think, in their perspective, it's too small. What they're forgetting is they're doing God's will. They're doing God's work through his power. That however insignificant they see it, this is what God has assigned them to do. Therefore, it's a great work. See, the Bible is punctuated with examples of God's people, with his help, achieving incredible things that really begin by implementing small things that don't seem to make that much of a difference. Think back on a few of these. Think about Jochebed. Jochebed saved the life of her baby, Moses. And by doing so, saved him by putting him in a simple little basket of woven reeds. By doing that, delivered a nation of slaves. Later, that same baby boy, by use of his simple rod, the rod that he would hold up, would part the waters of the Red Sea. He would allow the Israelites to cross over into Sinai on their way to Canaan. He'd later hold that same rod up, and his people would defeat a more powerful army just by holding up a rod, because it was God's power. It wasn't in the simple, small thing. When Israel was about to enter into that promised land, what did they do? Well, they sent spies in to check out the land. And Rahab received those spies and hid them. And by use of just a small red cord, she assisted in their escape. And that in doing so, she facilitated this early phase of God's plan of redemption for his people. Fast forward to the days of the judges, when Samson uses the jawbone of a dead donkey to defeat the Philistines and saves his people. So then you move forward to the New Testament. You think of Paul. You think of Paul, whose life is threatened by the Jews in Damascus. And he's delivered not by a powerful military force, not by an army that shows up, but they put him in a basket and lower him over the wall. So his mission is able to continue. See, we should never disparage the small things. The small things that God frequently uses to accomplish great ends, to accomplish his purpose and his will. See, that's what God tells Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. This is where Paul's asking about the thorn in his flesh to be taken out, but kind of yanking this out of context, I guess, a little bit. Look what he says in verse 9. God said to him, he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in small things. It says in weakness. But that's the idea, sufficient grace. God's grace can get us through even when we're just dealing in what we think are little things. See, we need to remind ourselves that those little things are oftentimes big things to some people. A little smile, a little note in the mail, a little pat on the back when you can touch people again. It's just a little encouragement. Those acts of kindness can lift somebody's spirit who might really, really need it. That's what those small things do from us to other people. So in that sense, is there really any such thing as small things? Now, here's the flip side of all that. Thinking back to my desk and my chair. Love my desk. Griped about my chair. Paul says in Philippians chapter 2, verse 14, it says, do everything without grumbling and arguing. Some translations say without complaining and disputing. I hope when we do get back, I hope when we're all back together again, I hope we're able to put aside the complaining about the little things. You know what I'm talking about. You might have heard yourself saying, hopefully you're the person who goes, I've never said this, but maybe you've heard yourself or somebody, that other guy, say this, that somebody sat in my pew. Somebody took my parking space. I don't like these old songs. I don't like these new songs that we're singing. The sermon's too long. The sermon's too short. I hope we realize how special our church family is. I hope we realize through all this how incredible those times of being together in worship really are. And I hope we don't ever complain again. I mean, I know we will, but I hope it at least subsides for a while. It reminds me of a quote from Bob Cratchit in Dickens' Christmas Carol when they're after Tiny Tim has passed in the visits from the spirits or whatever, but they're sitting around with a family, and Bob Cratchit says, "I know, my dears, that when we recollect about Tiny Tim, that we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it." Okay, it's a weird illustration, but take out Tiny Tim and insert quarantine. I hope that when we think about this time of being isolated and separated, that we won't quarrel, that we won't complain, that we won't grumble about those little things and forget this time in doing it. Recently, just a couple of days ago, I set up a Zoom meeting, something that was new to me. I mean, I've learned this in the last few weeks, but I set up a Zoom meeting with my family. My mom fell and hurt herself. We said my dad did tell us about all the details, and instead of him calling all four of us siblings, I just set up this meeting. And like I said, it wasn't a huge deal. I just figured out how to do it myself. But to see my parents' face, my whole family's in Oklahoma, to see my parents' faces, to see my brother and my sisters for the first, all of us together, yes, on a screen, but all of us together for the first time, literally in years, was so cool. And then to hear my dad thank me for that. It was just a little thing, but it was so worth it. It was so cool for us. It was a small thing, but it meant so much. When we return from all this and we get back to meeting, back to seeing one another, things won't be immediately back to normal. Potlucks, fellowships, hugs, stuff like that are going to be put on hold for a while. But we'll still be able to impact the lives of our church family and outside our church family with small things. Texts, emails, notes in the mail, phone calls, things that seem so little now carry such gigantic significance. Asking from across the street how your neighbor's doing, see if they need anything, see if you can help them, and sharing posts on social media, sharing Bible verses on social media, thoughts from your congregation, sharing your congregation's efforts to share worship, share all those things that seem to be so, just click share, put it on your Facebook feed or whatever. Things that seem so little now have such enormous impact. Those used to be little things, but they aren't anymore. Little things mean a lot, but not all little things. I miss my dad. I'm working at home at a much smaller desk in a much smaller area. I miss being able to spread all my mess out all over my desk. I would have never thought how much I'd miss my chair, but I do. And I hope when we get back to meeting together as a church family, that those little things that seem so insignificant, that we'll really jump on those and do those to encourage each other. But the small things that don't matter, I hope we forget those and that we just focus on how much we enjoy, how great it is to be together as a church family. Take care, stay healthy. God bless all of you. Thanks again for watching these videos. Maybe we'll see you again next Saturday. If not, take care. God bless.